Welcome to our second installment of the Journal Club. Today, our journal is Structural Intersectionality as a New Direction for Health Disparities Research, and it focuses heavily on intersectionality as a way to connect what's the disparities of things that are happening on a more macro level. I'm pretty sure, right, Jacquilyn?
It's good.
Yes. It's just yes, of course.
So I'm just gonna go ahead and let Jackie take it away.
Yes. All right. And then so I'll have Dr. Austin. Yes, perfect. So we'll be talking about, as Brittany said, the structural intersectionality as a new direction for health disparities research. It's essentially trying to represent structural racism, sexism, and income inequality in the United States particularly. And later on, we will see what parts of the states, based on the sample representatives or the sample data from the research from these authors, which is Patricia Holman, Tyson H. Brown, and Brittany King, have collected. And so the study aim would be to advance the field of intersectionality in terms of administrative sources and data that will be provided later on to introduce intersectionality and what intersectionality is in terms of how structural racism, sexism, and income inequality does perpetuate within institutional systems. And then so if we press on again for the study significance, perfect. All right, so for the significance of the study, it's essentially like the aim. Give me a second, sorry. Yeah, it's essentially like the aim. It's to develop and incorporate these studies to have a new approach, at least in the healthcare setting. And then we can go ahead and press on the next slide. And then so at first, if we're not all familiar, but I'm sure you guys will be familiar with what intersectionality is, but it is a framework and analytic tool that help impacts overlapping systems of oppressions, and it utilizes a multi-dimensional approach with examining inequities in societal facets like education, economy, housing, healthcare, essentially in the criminal justice system. And then the intersectionality in association to health disparities will be in ways that intersectionality provides that multi-dimensional approach to combat that unidimensional approach with studying health. And an example would be there's a health gap between men and women, which is in terms of gendered sexism, which is greater among Blacks than of whites. So the Black-white health gaps are greater among women and men. And what this means is that an individual can be experiencing oppression or discrimination not only because of their gender but also their race and other factors overlapping that. Or in other words, these determinants are inseparable factors and they overlap each other. And then in here, the study shows a relationship between socioeconomic status and health is racialized, and some of the resources for and the example here is that some of the resources for Blacks are less compared to whites, which shows in terms of health gaps with resources. Lastly, health is jointly shaped by interlocking axes of race, gender, and class stratification. So those who are in subordinate positions across social hierarchies experience the worst health outcomes. So yeah, and then we can go ahead and move forward. Just additional to that also, structural racism and sexism in societal domains are higher levels in US state levels across the educational, economic, and judicial and political domains of that. They are seen to be associated with poor birth outcomes and higher odds of myocardial infarction um, in terms of the health aspect to it. And then structural economic inequality, there has been a recent study shows that U.S. state level income is negatively associated with life expectancy. Nonetheless, it shows association at least for structural inequality and health disparity. And lastly, toward a structural intersectionality approach, the reason why these studies are being um, the, the studies have been being researched is to advance this field to associate health disparity and intersectionality and look through it in a sociological medical perspective as well. So it highlights social inequities in macro level. It underscores consequences of multiple systems of oppression of marginalized groups and intersecting systems of oppressions, and to show that these intersecting systems of oppression shape health in different mechanisms such as social capital, power, prestige, autonomy, self-esteem, and increased exposure to health risks are some of these consequences from these disparities um, if we're later able to advance this this field to become a little bit more known for healthcare or health administrations as well. And then we can go ahead and move forward to the methods section. And I'll just briefly go over how the study was collected in terms of data and how they were able to come up with some conclusions here. But the data came from the behavioral risk factor surveillance system. And in here, 420,644 individuals were analyzed and collected in terms of data. And in terms of age, it was 20 and older for those that have been researched upon in terms of demographic. And then the independent variable would be the structural racism and sexism indicators and income, which will be seen later, and the dependent variable, which is essentially the outcome from those independent variable, would be the self-related health measures. Um, and I'll just briefly go over the covariates and analytic strategies. In terms of the covariate, let me just double check I have notes. For covariates, it's to minimize the risk of these confounding effects. It just adjusts for an additional state level factors that have been shown to be associated with health. And some of these covariates are unemployment rates, proportion of the population, a dummy variable, which is whether the state is in a region. A dummy variable, which is indicating whether the state is in the southern region of the US, since they are trying to accumulate from different regions of US, just to minimize that confounding effects. And then for the analytic strategies, it is representative in descriptive statistics um, uh, to examine how the structural intersectionalities jointly shape the health of the population groups among different state levels and race and gender lines. So they estimated it's through a multi-level linear model. So from those analytic strategies, they were able to predict self-rated health as a function of structural exposures. And so if we move forward to the next, I'll show the table. And table one is essentially their model data for behavioral risk factor surveillance systems and other sources that will be found in table 2, 3, and 4. And then table 2 talks about the Black women, Black men, white women, and white men variables here, and their self-rated health reports, or I forgot what they're called, but they're self-rated health measures. There you go. And then as we can see here, and then we can move back to the results.
Yep.
Sorry, to move forward.
This one?
From figure 1.
Okay.
Okay.
Figure 1. Well, sorry. We did table figure 1. There we
Yes.
go.
Yeah. And so in figure 1, you will see that it shows the structural racism tends to be highest in Midwestern and Northern states, which is consistent in prior studies from these regions. Especially, they have high levels of racial inequality in educational, economic, housing, and judicial remains. And then we can move forward to figure 2. And then figure 2 shows that structural racism is highest in the southern, highest in southern and Rocky Mountains regions. And then for figure 3, just on the right, it shows that income inequality is highest along both coast and in state and large populations, such as, just checking clearly there, it's the New York, California, Florida, and Texas. In terms of income inequality. And so, yeah, so figure 1 was a structural racism, figure 2 was structural sexism, and figure 3 was income inequality. And then figure 4 on the next, I believe.
That's the table.
Okay, oh, table.
Yeah,
Sorry.
table 3.
Table 3. That's for table 3. Um, and then, oh, perfect. So table 3 shows the structural sexism exhibits a small to moderate negative correlation with both state level and structural racism and income inequality. So this is for table these table 3 was extracted from both figure 1, 2, and 3, and seen correlation based from the BF sorry, I forgot the BRFSS data as well. And then from, I believe, if we go back to, actually, if we move forward, I can't seem to find figure 4. I think.
Well, on the actual paper, it says figure 4 for the one that we just saw.
Oh, okay, got it.
Predicted self-health rated across structural and individual
Yes.
level.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So figure 4 was meant to, if you have the article but pulled up somewhere, figure 4
Yeah, that
actually
one.
shows.
Yeah,
Yes.
so we made it. That was my mistake, Brittany. It should read to
Sorry.
we have
It's
table
okay.
3, which is table 3 is just the top. It says this structural
Oh, right.
sexism and income inequality. That's correct. What we failed to do is to label the one with the graph figures. That is figure 4. So sorry about that.
Yes. So figure 4 was the main measures in terms of structural sexism, racism, and income inequality. And essentially, figure 4 shows that Black women had the worst self-rated health measures and are most affected by various structural inequality. And what they meant by various is not only were their race contributed to this poor and worse self-rated health, but also it is because of their gender and being a woman as well. So you can see that Black men, white women, and white men who are exposed to high levels of sexism, along with both high levels of racism and sexism, or both have worse self-rated health than those of the lower levels of all 3 inequalities. And then let me see if I can find the model. Yes, for that one. Yes, and then it just shows again, as I mentioned earlier, it's just a small to moderate negative correlation, but there is still um it there is still a slight association, and I'd like to just kind of assert that there hasn't been much of studies related to these three structural sexism, structural um, income inequality, and structural racism has been done. So these are still being advanced, and that's why um, this paper shows to this paper is a leading guide into incorporating intersectionality and other research to further expand this error and see what can be made to um, progress the field. And then go ahead and discuss more. So we'll go ahead and move forward, Dr. Austin. Perfect. And then um, table 4. All right. And then table 4 is just essentially the table extracted from figure 4 as well. A little bit more um, a little bit more informations in terms of all the um, correlations for multiple level for the self-rated related health. And here you can see the demographics for each and which regions, and also the covariate variables alongside with the independent variables. Um, and yeah, and then we can move forward to I was discussing figure 1, 2, and 3 with the discussion, so we can move and skip forward to that. Yes, that one as well.
Okay.
And then yes, and then so in terms of discussion in the paper, we've seen that systems of oppression vary considerably across the US. The paper is suggesting that, or the authors are suggesting that states are important units of analysis for understanding the exclusion and subordination across institutional domains. There is, as mentioned, from the self-rated health measures and the association, there has been relatively weak to moderate negative correlations among structural racism, sexism, and income inequality. But this suggests that distinct processes are at work in generating systems of oppression. And so, an example would be an increased subordination of Black people may allow white women to advance career, which is a higher status position. That's just one of the examples in terms of potentially interdependent tandem of oppression. And then as for state level structural conditions, that individual state level structural conditions may jointly shape health, and results show that state level policies and practices may shape aspects of social worlds affecting health, education, employment, voting, real estate, incarceration. And then um, one of the main things that has been discussed also is that the overlapping systems of oppression intersect with race and gender statuses to shape health. As I mentioned earlier, from the examples over on the structural inequalities and health disparities, and then macro level structural factors or micro level health outcomes are contingent of individual level social statuses. And then the challenges in this study is essentially that studies did not include other domains beyond the labor market or um, um, other forms of oppression has not been added as a contributing factor, um, such as segregation. Incarceration was also not mentioned, in political representation, reproductive freedom, and such are not mentioned as an overlapping oppression. So it still remains an open question on how the larger systems contribute to this overlapping discrimination. And then The next slide. My perspective and my perspective with regards to this study is that intersectionality perspective can potentially advance future sociological literatures on structural racism and sexism, and um, health is undermined by intersecting structural inequalities and interventions. So, and health, the healthcare administration should directly target these systems of oppressions that may contribute to how the healthcare may function, maybe from staff, maybe from from staff members or administrative members or faculty members in healthcare settings, and that a structural intersectionality approach um, aids to use what in social work vocabulary or jargon would be critical praxis, and praxis is essentially the social justice that may provide health equity or customized access to these individuals um that are experiencing multiple factors of oppression. And that's for the next slide. In terms of concluding the study, on what has been talked about in the study, we know that integrating insights from emerging literature on structural discrimination in health can and may potentially enhance quantitative intersectional health disparities research in ways that are consistent with um, social inequalities, inequities, intersecting systems of oppression, social context, and complexity. And that empirical analysis states that structural racism, sexism, and income inequality among states vary, and that they intersect in a variety of ways, regardless of weak to moderate correlation across states, and then and that empirical analysis states that they're jointly shaped health and are most consistently associated um, poor with poor self-rated health outcomes with the population of Black women. And the study implicates that structural racism, sexism, and income or economic inequality undermine health that may suggest targeting these issues especially when working with um, ethnic minorities, marginalized groups, and it would take a lot of studies and researches and more quantitative approach with trying to um collect data. So yeah, um that's the main um data and insights collected from the literature um from structural intersectionality, and as a new direction to study health disparities. And I believe, at least from the reference and the resources um, stated on this peer review, I do believe that this is one of the studies that have tried looking at intersectionality um, a way as a way to look at the health gaps in terms of varying states, such as like northern or western or southern regions. This was one of the first um or yeah, at least from what I know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, this is one of the articles that have um looked at intersectionality as a form of health disparity research. And yes, that's it for the entire study as for this paper. And if you have any questions with regards to the presentation, that's perfect. I can try And maybe if I don't know, I'll have Dr. Austin intervene. But yes, this is
Can,
majority.
can you go back to figure 4, Dr. Austin? That one.
This
Oh,
one?
no,
Yeah.
go back.
Yeah.
That one. Yeah. Yeah. So I thought it was really interesting, the way that you pointed out that perhaps the reason why white women are self-rating themselves higher than even Black men is because of the oppression of just all around Black people. So that way white women might get hired for more superior positions in instead of Black men or even Black women. So I thought that was interesting to see.
Yeah, I think you guys can see my notes. I have so many notes. I'll try to be brief because I know we don't have so much time, but for me, everybody here knows that intersectionality is really a key interest of mine. And reading this paper, and I would like to, first of all, thank you for the work you put into preparing for this paper, as well as doing a good job presenting this. But there are things that I actually learned that were, I think it's always good to learn, and it shows that there's just so much of this that actually needs to be sort of teased
Addressed.
out more, and more granularly. So basically what this looks at is intersectional perspectives, so the way people are seeing it, and they added structural racism and sexism to come up with this sort of structural intersectionality. And I think this idea is new. Because what it does is it looks at intersectionality turns out to have a certain fluidity to it. And what I mean by that is what you see, for instance, if we go back to these figures here in figure 1, figure 2, let's look at figure 2 here, just for instance, just here, you see structural sexism. It isn't the same everywhere. And I think that's the thing we sort of get into our minds, is that there's this homogeneity around the country, when in fact, you can see where there were states that did poorly, really poorly on this measurement, and did quite okay in the next measurement, which would have been income inequality. So you could see where California does really well in figure 2 with structural sexism, but then doesn't do well at all with the next metric, which is income inequality. And if we go back here to the figure, whoops, sorry about that, got excited. This figure, this was structural racism. Looking at these states, some of this is actually, if we look at how we think about these things, it's not that surprising, but we see structural racism being higher in places like, what we associate with liberalism, like New York. That surprised me a bit.
Washington, even.
Yeah, I was really shocked to see that Minnesota's there. Really, really surprised to see that. And then you have structural racism that is actually non-existent, or in certain places. And so it isn't just enough to look at the data, but it's also to ask that third question, so to speak. Okay, what's behind this? So if you look at, for instance, Montana, it has no measurable structural racism. I'm not so sure about that, other than to say, how many people of color by percentage do you really have in those places? And like Wyoming, there are more people in my apartment than Wyoming. And so this idea of, you don't really have structural racism there, we have to be a little bit careful about what the data tells us. Not that this data is not accurate, but we have to ask those questions about, what does this actually mean? What are sort of like the internals there? One thing I did want to do is to point out the definition on the second page of this article, which is at the top, it says 351. The definition that they give for intersectionality, I think, is a little bit, it's not as expanded as it could be. So I want to make sure everybody understands when I'm thinking of intersectionality, it is the analytical framework for understanding difference plus social, sort of political identities that come together to give you, it disadvantages you. So that's the discrimination part. And it has to also see where you have that advantage. And I think it's important to look at it that way, because, even as a Black male, in this country, if we're looking at just my individual intersectionality. Being a male is an advantage. Being Black is a disadvantage. Having a high education is an advantage. Not making as much money as I'd like. That's a disadvantage. So you always have these things, and it's not like, things that are happening sometimes are, here and there. These are things that are occurring simultaneously. And so I think that's another thing to keep in mind when you're looking at these metrics. Now, Jackie, you are correct, and so are the authors in this paper, when they suggest that the majority of the things, the majority of the sort of like the intersectional identities that we look at with respect to discrimination or oppression, that would be looking at income, looking at race, looking at sex, these sorts of things. These have actually been studied individually and not together. And that's where it really gets really interesting for me, because I wrote down something here with respect to sort of like how this comes into play. So, for instance, you have this idea that being this is a Black Maternal Health Week, and so we spent a lot of time on this specific subject, and you should actually go and see our video on this. Is one of two-part series. But the idea of being, for instance, a Black female, your education level, all these things actually they're additive. So some of these things are actually acting together to make things worse than it would have been otherwise. So if you look at these things individually, you may miss the compounding effect. And I had actually wrote down this term here last night, and I wanted to share that with you. So yeah, we've all, well, I don't know how many of you have heard of this, but you may have heard this concept of cumulative advantage. And basically what that means is, for instance, if you have a student, and they've been doing this a lot in different Western countries, where people will hold their kids out until they're 6 or 7 years old, so that when they do go into school, they're older, they know more than the other kids, and that advantage that they had, it compounds over life. And so the kids behind them never really catch up. This is the same thing here, especially when we look at the driving factors behind the disparities in Black women's health, is there's a cumulative disadvantage. So you have all of these things that are actually sort of coming together. And if you look at page 352, it looks at, some of these disadvantages that are associated with being a Black woman are actually coming together to make it even worse. And I think some of this may go on to explain why things like what we would think would be an advantage actually turns out to have no effect at all in many cases, and may make things worse. So when you look at the maternal death rate for Black women who are educated, it's 5 times higher than their white counterparts. And what we usually do is we associate an education level with sort of a better life, better access to healthcare, these sorts of things. And in this case, it doesn't help. And I think that's sort of an interesting thing. I've talked a lot to say, so I'll jump out, and if anyone else actually wants to make some contribution here.
I think for me, just adding on to that, I like that you point out that it does happen simultaneously, and that it can both impact, it can both be a disadvantage, and let's say, you said you said a word that's actually very true. It's a disadvantage, and it's what puts you to place on some
Cumulative?
Yes, they're cumulative disadvantage. And there's also, it's what your privilege can be as well, despite those overlapping systems of identity that you are, and what you mark yourself as, because it does mark your oppression and also your privilege at the same time. And it is additive, but I do agree, it is cumulative and it is additive. But I remember, I was reading over on what Kimberly Crenshaw had, when she coined this term of intersectionality. She was explaining how it's seen to be more of a traffic flow. And you're right, Dr. Austin. It's being it's all happening simultaneously. So you can think of it like a traffic flow where you're an individual in the middle of a street or a road, and every form of your identity, or your yes, every form of your identity, level of education, level of attainment, from your gender, from your sexual orientation, from your race, your class, your spirituality, all of that comes into place, and that's where you intersect. From the word itself, that's where you're intersect. It's just those institutional, like, levels of domains, or like societal domains, that um really um really marks where you are, or your status, or your place, um yeah, status, place, and where you are, from those identities. So that's where I think it's also interesting that 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 interesting, and I'm grateful that it has been, at least acknowledged, although not properly, and not properly, or at least um um
Widely.
widely, yes, widely, or given that credit, that it does have, like, we all have those implicit bias, action or not action, they're seen, or they imply some things, regardless of whether or not it shows moderate, like, to weak correlation of those, like, identities and those oppression.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And especially as you appeal to, because one of the driving things here is you, from a structural standpoint, both individual and structural,
Uh-huh.
is going to be the implicit biases. Because of course that your thought processes, sort of like what you have, what you imagine when you think of, for instance, a Hispanic woman. If you have certain ideas of what sort of characteristics she holds, what her ideas are, what kind of food she likes to do, how many children she has, at what age she got married, her job, her income level, all of those things can get you into trouble. And I just want to point out one other thing pursuant to demonstrating this point. This is back on page 351, and it talks about a little bit about this concept of essentialism. That's problematic because essentialism also is based on this idea of implicit bias. So basically, what essentialism is people, by being part of a specific group of that could include sex, race, what have you. If you're from another country, whatever other country it is, by virtue of being from that group, you have these characteristics. You follow me? So basically, as if we go back to this example, as a Hispanic woman, then you have these characteristics. Okay, these are the things you like. Invariably, you like these foods. You drive this kind of car. This is kind of the kind of job that you have, and it only takes 2 seconds to figure out that essentialism doesn't really work. But as a thought process, in the way we actually, the lens through which we look at people in society, it can be problematic because we're like, okay, though they're all like that. Everybody from Salvador, that's just how they are. And it allows you to dehumanize people and to treat them in a certain way. And this becomes really a problem in the clinic because this
Mhm.
leads to differential treatment. And,
Uh-huh.
and of course, it has the ability to impact health outcomes. On the screen, I have one of the studies that's actually mentioned in the study that you presented, and this is Bring Out Your Dead, a study of income inequality and life expectancy in the United States. And this is from 2000 to 2010. And this study was done back in 2018. And just reading the abstract here, actually, you can go through this paper if you ever have an opportunity to do so. And they say that they find that state level income inequality is inversely associated with female and male life expectancy. And to me, that's really interesting. And they also said that we observe this general pattern across 4 measures in income equality and under the rigorous conditions of state-specific and year-specific effects. The only thing that I really wanted to see were the data here, and you couldn't get a hold of it. I think you have to actually buy this article. Sometimes that's the case. But looking at these kinds of studies, and I think the more we can actually find frameworks that work, that look at how these inequalities are playing with one another and sometimes against one another, I think that that's where a lot of value can be created in terms of trying to dismantle these systems. Again, going back to this one that still sticks in my head, the fact that Black educated women still, it's still worse off for them. And also how, this perception of oneself. There's a story that Dr. Gina Johnson talks about in the podcast that we just released, I think it was yesterday, where she had a friend who was being treated in a clinical setting by a physician, and she was under intense pain. And she tells it better, but this is how I remember it. And instead of communicating to them that, I think they were trying to get a line in, an IV line. And instead of communicating this to them, what happened was they ended up causing great injury. And, she complained to her husband. He's like, well, you should tell them. And her reason for not telling them was that she didn't want to be perceived as the angry Black woman. And it's crazy because she was trying to do something that, not for herself so much, but for a whole race of people, a whole sex of people, and also to make the people who were treating her feel better so that they wouldn't, have a bad opinion about her. And to me, that is just madness, because as it turns out, she still doesn't have full function of one of her hands. I don't remember which one it is.
I think it was her left.
Yeah. I think with that, just being part of like so many different circles of oppression, I think we try really hard to not be a stereotype. If it is, an angry Black woman, or if it is, not be part of for Latinos, breaking, surpassing teen pregnancy, that was a lot of Latinos's, picture and stuff. So I really think that we try really hard not to be part of that statistic, and we stay quiet, even though like there's something going on. And one thing that I also wanted to question about, with the whole education and, with Black women and educated and still not having access to quality healthcare. I wonder if there is a bias with just because you're educated doesn't mean that you're actually in a different socioeconomic status. Many of us who are educated are in huge debt because of the education that we have behind us to try to get an education. It's expensive. So we end up being still in the poverty level, because think about it, master's degrees are $100,000 to $200,000,
Degree.
yeah. So I'm wondering, like, because of that, if there's a correlation behind that.
And they said, no matter your education level, you won't get promoted if, or not that you won't, but it's less likely if you're a person of color even be promoted, even if you have those qualifications.
Right. And sometimes, again, we want to surpass that statistic. So what do? We go into higher education, get into more debt, and still trying to move up that ladder of promotion by trying to, show proof that we're capable of doing this because of, look at my education level, right? However, we're still being surpassed because of these inequalities. It's just that's things that just popped into my head regarding like this article. And another thing too, now that we there's this data's out here and there's research out here, what are we doing to make this better? Looking at the education, looking at the agency perspective, if we know that there is a lot of healthcare inequalities in these areas, why are we not looking into building more clinics into areas that are for people that are in need? you know, need to have more access to it. You know, it's all about location. So what are we doing to fix this?
I think you are bringing up good points, because I think the disturbing part of this is if you look at the data, I shared this data with you. I can't find it now. I was looking at this data with respect to, if we go back to just, you know, Black maternal health, it goes beyond this issue of just differential access, right? Even when you have access, there are still problems. And I think what you're saying is that, you know, it's exactly what they're saying here, is that you have all of these different levels and trying to understand, okay, well, maybe you have a master's degree or what have you, but you also have, does that tell us anything about the level of healthcare that you have access to? You know what I'm saying? Just because you have, you know, an MFA or, you know, MBA or what have you, you know, or an MPH or any of these other degrees, you know, you, like you said, you've had to take out, you know, a tremendous amount of loan money in order to finance that. And it's not necessarily, you know, paying off right away. That's one thing. But then, like Brittany was saying, it's coupled with the idea that even if you do land the positions that you want, you're not advancing in the same, there's asymmetrical advancement. So you're more likely, and I'm just saying what the statistics tell us, you're more likely to be passed up for a promotion.
And even pay.
You're not
lower
advancing
pay.
career at the same rate or with the same trajectory as you would see some person from this, you know, sort of the dominant group. So you have all of these things sort of coming into play, and the corrections that we expect to see, we're not seeing them. And going back to this idea about the data that I showed both Brittany and you, and I think I've also shown it to Jackie, is that over these years, just on a metric of, you know, Black maternal health, it has not gotten better. It was really bad before the pandemic. It got worse. Everybody got worse during the pandemic, but then afterwards, it's even worse. On this group, and it's like, what, you know, what can be the, how is this still the same thing in 2023? And it's not like this data is new and no one had any idea. This is data that's been out there for many years. And I think that's the frustration. And when talking to people, and, you know, asking, what else can we do? What's possible? I know that there are some resources, but it's clearly not enough, because if they were, we wouldn't still have these issues. So that's the
well, right. And I think, you know, when we're talking or listening to Brittany Clark and listening to Dr. Johnson's podcast, you know, a lot of it has to do with, you know, the implicit bias of how to treat our patients of color. And again, you know, they normally, if they have if women of color are having terrible experiences going to a clinic, they're not going to continue on with any type of treatment or even, you know, trying to seek help.
Absolutely.
So that's one thing. Even, you know, this is relating to, you know, treating patients with care. It's like, how can we improve their experience, you know, with, you know, by providing them with exceptional customer service, so that way they're empowered. So that way they feel that they are partnered with their clinics and they feel empowered to continue on treatment and to seek help when they need it. So it's, again, what are we doing on the individual level, working in a healthcare, to empower people to, you know, take charge of their health.
And then my last thing, and I wanted to say about this, and then I see we've got basically 8 minutes left. It's the idea of perceived interpersonal discrimination, sort of more individualized. You know, I think in past research studies that I actually looked at, gave this metric a little, I think it's an important metric, let me be clear, but I think it gave it too much consequence, too much power. And what I mean by that is, in doing so, it misses the structural problems there, the larger, the macro problem. I think that we need to be careful about, you know, just not that we, you know, the individual part is not important, it is, but if we're looking at going after the structural racism, the structural sexism, these sorts of, you know, these structural disparities, then we can actually start to address them at the individual level. Because my idea is if you can actually knock it down at the macro level, the individual level will cure itself, so to speak, because then you're removing those overarching things that are actually controlling what's going on at the individual level. That's thought there.
Right, I agree.
Yes. Anybody have any other thoughts? Well, Ed, for me, I will hang on to this paper. I usually in journal club, I read them and I'm like, okay, I'm done with that. This one I will hang on to because I think there's a lot to be learned. And I do really enjoy the fact that they're taking this approach where they're looking at how all of these different things are coming together. Because it's not always that they're coming together to make things worse. Sometimes they act against one another. So you have to really pay attention to what the data is telling you. And yeah, so Brittany, you can close our session unless anyone else has anything else to add.
No, just thank you, Jackie, for this journal's awesome presentation.
Thank you so much, Jackie.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you guys for coming in and listening. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everybody. That concludes our journal club for this month for structural intersectionality as a new direction for health disparities research.
Okay, thank you so much.
You guys all
Thank you
next time.
guys. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thanks for
You guys
coming.
have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.